The relief crew blows the whistle, but nothing answers back. They try to force the gate, but it's locked, bolted from the inside. Up the path, the wind is howling and the sea is pounding against the cliffs. But inside the cottage, everything is wrong. The kitchen is still warm, the fire is still burning, and the meal sits half-eaten on a table. And the single chair, just one, lies overturned on the floor, as if someone stood up in a blind panic. 3 lighthouse keepers are assigned to this rock, and all 3 are gone. Outside, the supply boxes are exactly where the boat left them. All the clocks in the lighthouse have stopped, and in the logbook, someone has written about a terrifying storm of men praying, a veteran keeper weeping, and waves hammering the tower. But on that night, the sea was calm. This isn't a story about 3 men lost at sea. This is a story about how an island swallowed them whole. Now we have to understand the men, because on paper, these men were impossible to break. James Ducott, who was 35 years old, was the principal keeper. This wasn't just a job for him. It was a 20-year career built on the most isolated rocks in the North Atlantic. He knew the sea better than he knew his own home. But more importantly, he had a life waiting for him. He had a wife, 4 children, and he was the anchor for his family on the mainland. For a man like Ducott, the light wasn't just a beacon for ships, it was his ticket home. Now we move on to Thomas Marshall. He's 29 years old, he's the second assistant. He was a quiet but methodical man, and arguably the most disciplined of the 3. Marshall was the kind of man who didn't just follow protocol, he lived by it. He was single with no family to return to, which made him the perfect candidate for long, lonely shifts on Eland Moor. He was the steady hand that every crew needs. And then there was Donald MacArthur. He was 40. He was a veteran occasional keeper, a man who lived his life in the gaps, filling in for others. He was a widower with 2 children, and he spent his entire adult life moving from one remote tower to another. He was used to the silence, and he was definitely used to the cold. The Northern Lighthouse Board doesn't hire reckless, they hire discipline. They hire men who can stare at the horizon for weeks on end without even blinking. So what happens when the elite simply vanish? To understand Eland Moor, you have to understand the ground it stands on. The locals don't call it an island. They call it the Phantom of the 7 Hunters. Legend says that centuries ago, 7 men were shipwrecked here. They weren't keepers, they were survivors. But the island didn't want them to survive. It's said that they went mad in the silence, waiting for rescue that never came. Some say they killed each other over scraps of food. Others say they simply just walked into the Atlantic, one by one, led by voices only they could hear. The local Hebrides refused to set foot on the rock. They believed that the lighthouse was built on unholy ground, and that the light itself was an insult to whatever lived in the shadows of the 7 Hunters. When the board built that tower, they didn't consult the locals. They ignored the stories. They brought in men from the mainland who didn't know the weight of the rock they were standing on. But isolation has a way of making you believe things you shouldn't. Imagine being trapped there for weeks with nothing to read but the logbooks of men who sat in the chair before you. Reading their notes, feeling their shadows, you begin to wonder if the island is finished with the hunters or if it's just waiting for a new set of guests. On December 15th, the logbook became a document of a mental breakdown. December 12th, storm is increasing. December 13th, the gale is increasing. On December 14th, terrific gale all night. Waves hammering against the tower. Men are praying. Then, the final haunting line, on December 15th, everything else appears normal. Everything else appears normal. Think about that for a second. A man wrote these words while describing an apocalypse. But here's the problem. The Admiralty weather records tell a different story. On the day that the logbook describes a terrific gale, the weather service recorded calm. The pressure was rising, the sea was manageable, but there was no storm. So why did they write it? Why did 3 professional men, trained to observe the sky with clinical precision, describe a storm that didn't exist? There's only one real answer. The storm was real to them. Not outside, but inside. Think about the psychological toll. Were they hallucinating, or was the island projecting a terror so visceral that they could feel the tower shaking, even as the sea lay flat? There is a theory that rarely makes the official reports. It focuses on Donald MacArthur. MacArthur was the outsider. He was the widower. He was the one filling in. Some investigators believe that the ghost storm wasn't a collective hallucination, but a narrative forced upon a group by one man who had finally snapped. Imagine MacArthur, a man who had spent his whole life in isolation, finally reaches his limit. He begins to see the storm. He begins to weep. He convinces the younger Marshal that the end is coming. He forces Ducat, the principal, into a state of panic. The overturned chair wasn't from a wave, it was from a confrontation. When Moore found the kitchen, it was warm. The fire was still burning. But why was MacArthur's coat still on the peg? Perhaps because he was the one who didn't need a coat. Perhaps he was the one who led the others into the darkness, promising them that the only way to survive the storm was to embrace the sea. Theory is one thing, but physical evidence? That is where the logic truly breaks. When Joseph Moore finally forced his way into the compound, he didn't find a scene of chaos. He found a fortress. The entrance gate was shut, the main door was shut, and the inner door was shut. All 3 barriers were bolted from the inside. Now think about the physics of that. To leave the island, they had to go out. To go out, they had to leave the doors unbolted. Yet Moore found a sealed box. Upstairs, the beds were unmade as if men had been startled out of their sleep. Yet there was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no broken glass. Just a single overturned chair in the kitchen. And then there's the detail that haunts every investigator. It's the coats. To face a North Atlantic winter, you need an oilskin. 2 of them were gone. But as we said before, Donald MacArthur's was still there, hanging on its peg. It means a veteran keeper, a man who knew the bite of the salt spray better than anyone, ran out into the night in his shirt sleeves, leaving behind a lighthouse that was for all intents and purposes still perfectly locked from the inside. So look, the official story is that a freak wave just took them. It's clean, it's easy, it's what the Northern Lighthouse Board told everyone to make the problem go away. But come on, a wave doesn't just lock 3 heavy doors from the inside. And a wave definitely doesn't explain a ghost storm that only existed in a dead man's logbook. So what happened on Eileen Moore? Honestly, it wasn't just some maritime accident. It was a total breakdown. Maybe it was the weight of the silence. Maybe it was a private hell they couldn't escape. Or maybe the island just wanted its territory back. We're never going to know for sure. This case is closed on paper, but for anyone actually looking at the details, it's as open as the Atlantic itself. See, the island is still there, the light still works, and somewhere, out in that cold, gray water, 3 men are still missing. All they left behind was an empty chair and a silence that honestly still hasn't been broken.